Today we're at Gosnell Cemetery, or otherwise known as the Highgate United Church Cemetery. Long history out here on Gosnell Line in Highgate, just outside of Ridgetown. Mary Webb, a name that is familiar to many people in this area, she was credited as being one of the very first people to have religious services in her home. Originally in 1849, there was a small 20 by 30 church on this site here. So this was essentially a church graveyard. 20 years later, the church was moved or rebuilt in Highgate, but this has continued to be used by many of the families of the original families. There's a plaque here designated here for what is called the pioneers that struck ground in this area.
1849 is when the church was built over here. And Mary Webb owned Emerald Farm, which is that farm over there. And then she donated this piece of property for a church. They were meeting in her house.
Sure, yeah.
And so she decided that they had to have a church. So she donated the land and they built a church. Well, when you build a church back then, you had a cemetery.
Always attached.
Always attached.
Yeah.
So there was probably, if Sharon looked it up, 1812, there were probably descendants that were buried on this property.
Right.
And she decided this would be a good place for a church. They moved the church in the late 1800s to Highgate.
Oh, okay.
And it became the town hall. And in 1906, there was a cyclone came through and took the roof off of it. And when they rebuilt it, they bricked it. Well, then a few years ago, it was in bad shape, so they just tore it down. Usually in the spring, the board gets together and we advertise it in the paper, and we have a cleanup day in the spring.
Okay, so families that have
members here, and it's amazing now. Like at first, 25 years ago, it was pretty much just the board members that showed up and cleaned things up.
Right.
And now there's a whole crew that shows up, and quite often we can come in here and we can rake it and clean everything all up, trim the shrubs, and we're done before noon.
You're not going to get a much more peaceful place than a cemetery.
No.
Especially these kind of cemeteries that they're just out, they're just off the beaten track.
Yeah.
And their community.
Not a lot of traffic.
Yeah, that's right.